The morning Nora Vasquez walked into the Hargrove County Courthouse with a cardboard box under one arm, and a silence about her that made the clerk look twice. The lobby was already thick with people who had come to watch her lose. They stood in the familiar clusters of any small agricultural county where everybody's business is everybody's entertainment. The feed store regulars along one wall, the women from the church auxiliary near the water fountain, and in the corner closest to the windows, a knot of men in pressed shirts and good boots who worked for Castellan Land Holdings or wanted it known that they might. Nora set her box on the check-in counter, gave her name to the clerk, and looked at none of them. Outside, the August heat pressed against the glass like something with a purpose, and the air inside smelled of old paper and the particular anxiety of people who are waiting to find out whether the ground they stand on still belongs to them. There was a legal proceeding scheduled for 10 o'clock that morning, and its subject was a 46-acre parcel on the eastern slope of the Cerro Prieto Ridge, and the question it meant to answer was whether that land belonged to Castellan Land Holdings through a chain of title they had spent 14 months and considerable money assembling, or whether it had belonged all along to Nora Vasquez, by a fact so simple and so old that it had survived divorce, fraud, and the general willingness of the powerful to believe that no one is watching. The clerk stamped her paperwork and slid it back without meeting her eyes. Nora picked up her box. She was 37 years old, and her hands were the hands of someone who had been working land since she was old enough to lift a shovel, and she did not look like a woman who was going to lose. She looked like a woman who had already won and was here to explain it calmly. The thing about a verdict rendered by the truth is that it was rendered a long time before the courthouse opens its doors. This story begins, as so many do, at the moment when something valuable was hidden, and it begins not in August, but in the January of the year Nora Vasquez lost her marriage, her savings, and very nearly her faith in her own recollection, and found in the ruin of all three the thing her father had left her, tucked in the page where the Gospel of John meets the Gospel of Mark, in a Bible no one had opened in 11 years. Her father, Gustavo Vasquez, had been a man of few words and tremendous thoroughness. He came from Sonora as a young man, found work as an orchard hand in the Eastern Valley, and over 30 years of careful saving bought the 46 acres on Cerro Prieto Ridge that everybody else had passed over because the soil was thin at the top and the access road was unpaved, and the only water source appeared to be a seasonally unreliable creek. Gustavo did not care about appearances. He sank 2 wells in his first 3 years, amended the thin soil with composted orchard trimmings for a decade before he planted a single tree, and built a house from salvaged lumber that was not beautiful, but was solid in the way that things built by people who cannot afford to rebuild them tend to be. He grew table grapes on the lower terraces and raised heritage apple varieties on the upper slope, and he taught Nora, his only child, that the land will tell you what it wants to do if you stop telling it what you want and start listening for what it says. He said this in Spanish, the way he said most important things, and the phrase in its original had a rhythm like something you could plant by. The land speaks in a whisper, Misha. You must be very quiet to hear it. She was 8 the first time he said it. She was still hearing it at 37, standing in a courthouse lobby with a cardboard box, and a community of doubters arranged around her like a frame. Gustavo died in the October of the year. Nora turned 23 when she was away at the State University, finishing an agricultural extension degree she would not complete, because she came home to bury him and found that grief, unlike coursework, does not have a deadline by which it can be managed. She managed the land instead. She ran the orchard and the vineyard alone for 4 years with the help of 2 seasonal workers and the counsel of her neighbor, Esperanza Robles, a woman of about 70 who had farmed the adjacent parcel since before Nora was born and who treated the land with a combination of empirical rigor and old country reverence that Nora recognized as her own inheritance in a different dialect. And then she met Daniel Fitch, and for 6 years she believed that two people could hold a piece of land together, and that a shared signature on a marriage license was the same thing as a shared intention. And she was wrong on the second count, though not, it turned out, on the first. Daniel Fitch was charming in the way that men who are very concerned with other people's perceptions of them are often charming, readily, warmly, and without remainder. He had ideas about the orchard that sounded like investment and turned out to be debt. He borrowed against the operating account for a specialty cider venture that failed in its second year, then borrowed again through a line of credit Nora had not known he had opened in both their names. And when the cider equipment had to be sold at 40 cents on the dollar and the line of credit came due, the 46 acres on Cerro Prieto Ridge were carrying a lien they had not been carrying before, and Daniel Fitch was already talking to a man named Warren Gould. Warren Gould was the Regional Acquisitions Director for Castellan Land Holdings, a company that owned approximately 12,000 acres of agricultural and commercial real estate in 3 counties, and was in the process of acquiring as much of the Eastern Valley Corridor as it could reach, because the Eastern Valley Corridor sat above a confined aquifer that was becoming, in an era of deepening drought, worth more per acre-foot than most of the crops grown over it. Warren Gould was 52, silver-haired, and wore the kind of khaki shirt that suggests outdoor competence without evidence of outdoor labor. He drove a company truck that was always clean. He had the handshake of a man who had decided long ago that warmth is a tool and had used it so consistently that he had perhaps forgotten it was a choice. He came to the Cerro Prieto property on a Tuesday in March, with Daniel standing slightly behind him and smiling the careful smile of a man who has already made a decision and is watching to see whether his partner will make it easier. And he looked at the terraced vineyards and the apple rows on the upper slope, and the 2 good wells, and the solid, ugly house. And he said, in the most reasonable voice in the world, that he was prepared to offer $340,000 for the parcel, which was, he said, a fair price given the access difficulties and the age of the infrastructure, and which was, he did not say, approximately 60% of the land's assessed value, and perhaps 40% of what it would be worth to Castellan once they logged it onto their water rights portfolio. Nora looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the middle distance. She said she was not selling. Warren Gould nodded as though she had said something mildly interesting and told her the offer stood, and he left, and the particular quality of silence he left behind was the silence of a door not quite closed. The divorce was filed in the following May. It was not a surprise in the way that bad weather is not a surprise when you have been watching the pressure drop for months. The terms Daniel sought in the initial filing listed the Cerro Prieto property as a shared marital asset subject to equitable division, and his attorney, a downtown practitioner who billed at a rate that made Nora's county legal aid representative look briefly pale, moved immediately for a forced sale to satisfy the marital debt, citing the lien on the property. The lien was real. The debt was real. The forced sale motion was, her legal aid attorney said, very possibly viable, and if the court ordered it, the most likely buyer at distressed auction would be, and here he paused the way people pause before they say something they have been professionally instructed to say, as though it is a neutral observation, an entity with the liquidity to move quickly. He did not say Castellan Land Holdings. He did not need to. Nora went home that evening and sat in her father's kitchen, which was still her kitchen and might not be her kitchen in 6 months. And she felt the specific weight of a person who has lost not just what they own, but what they were before they owned it, which is a heavier kind of loss and a less legible one. She sat there long enough for the light to go, and then she got up, because sitting in the dark is a form of agreement with the dark, And she went to the shelf where her father's books lived in the order he had left them. And she took down the Bible, and she opened it the way you open something that belonged to a dead man, carefully and with the sense that you are being watched. And on the page between the two Gospels, folded into thirds and soft with age, was a quitclaim deed dated 14 years earlier, executed by Gustavo Vasquez, conveying the 46 acres on Cerro Prieto Ridge to his daughter Nora Elena Vasquez as a gift in anticipation of marriage, acknowledged before a notary public in a town 40 miles away, and never recorded with the county. It was legal. It was valid. It had been waiting in the Bible for 14 years because Gustavo Vasquez had loved his daughter very quietly and had understood, with the thoroughness that marked everything he did, that a gift given before a marriage is outside the marriage, and that a deed does not need to be recorded to convey title, only to protect against subsequent claims by parties without notice, and that a daughter who inherited the deed inherited the protection, provided she moved quickly enough and knew what she had. Nora did not tell Daniel. She did not tell her legal aid attorney that night. She sat with the deed on the kitchen table and read it 3 times, and then she folded it back into the Bible, set the Bible on the highest shelf, and in the morning she called Esperanza Robles before 7, because Esperanza was always up before 7, and because there are certain conversations that can only happen early, in the particular honesty of early light. Esperanza came over with coffee she had already made and sat across from Nora at the same kitchen table, and looked at the deed for a long time without speaking. And when she did speak, she said, in the soft, accented cadence that she used for things she considered important, that Gustavo had told her about this deed years ago, long before Daniel Fitch had appeared, and that Gustavo had told her. A thing hidden with love is never truly lost. It is only waiting for the need. Esperanza said she had wondered sometimes whether Nora knew. Nora said she had not. Esperanza nodded as though this was consistent with how the world operated, and poured more coffee, and said that the next step was clear, and the next step was to record the deed immediately, this morning, before anyone who might be watching understood what she had found, because a deed that exists but is unrecorded is vulnerable to a subsequent purchaser who has no notice of it, and Castellan, with its title searches and its legal infrastructure, would be a subsequent purchaser very much with notice once that deed appeared in the county records. She said, "A seed under the soil is invisible to the frost. The moment it breaks the surface, the season must be right." This was Esperanza's way of saying, move today before the ground freezes again. Nora drove to the recorder's office that morning. She recorded the deed. The recording fee was $27. The deed, now part of the public record, was dated 14 years prior to the marriage and conveyed sole and separate property to Nora Elena Vasquez without encumbrance. Daniel Fitch's name appeared nowhere on it. The lien, which attached to marital property, attached to nothing. The divorce attorney for Daniel Fitch filed a motion to challenge the deed's validity within 3 weeks of its recording. This was expected. The challenge argued that the deed had been fabricated or backdated, a claim that required them to disprove the notary's acknowledgment, the dated stamps, and the physical age of the document, which a forensic document examiner retained by Nora's legal aid clinic, paid for by a small legal defense fund that Esperanza Robles organized among 4 neighboring farm families who had their own reasons to distrust Castellan land holdings, assessed as entirely consistent with paper and ink of 14 years ago. The motion was denied. A second motion argued that the gift deed was ineffective because it had not been delivered, a legal doctrine that requires a deed to be given to the grantee or held by a third party on the grantee's behalf, and that a deed hidden in a Bible in the grantor's home was arguably not delivered. This was the motion that made Nora's new attorney, a woman named Clara Ibanez, who handled agricultural property law out of an office 40 miles east, and who had come to the case after reading about the forensic examination in the county legal notices and calling Nora on a Thursday evening to say she would take it on a deferred fee, sit across the table with a legal pad, and explain, with the careful calm of someone who chooses her words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, that the question of delivery was genuinely arguable, and that the counter-argument depended on whether Gustavo Vasquez had retained control of the deed or had placed it somewhere the grantee could discover it, and that the distinction was, in plain language, whether a father who hides a deed in a Bible on a shelf in the house his daughter will inherit can be said to have delivered it to her across time. Clara Ibanez said that she believed the answer was yes, and that the case law on constructive delivery in this jurisdiction supported that belief, and that she was prepared to argue it, but that the best witness to Gustavo's intention was the person to whom he had described the deed's existence during his lifetime. Esperanza Robles was 73 years old, had been farming the adjacent parcel for 46 years, had no material interest in the outcome, and remembered with precision the conversation she had described to Nora over coffee. She gave her deposition in Clara Ibanez's conference room on a Wednesday afternoon in November, in her accented, unhurried Spanish, with a certified interpreter present, and she said that Gustavo Vasquez had told her he was putting the deed in his Bible where Nora would find it when she needed it, because he trusted his daughter to need the right things at the right time. The motion challenging delivery was denied. The deed stood. But Castellan Land Holdings was not finished, because organizations built on the acquisition of distressed assets do not stop when a legal route closes. They find the administrative route, and if that closes, they find the practical route, which is often the cruelest. Warren Gould did not file anything himself. What happened next came through the Hargrove County Water District, whose board included 2 members with financial relationships to Castellan that were not hidden, but were not advertised, and it came in the form of a priority review of water rights attached to parcels in the Cerro Prieto subbasin, announced in January of the following year, which was the year the drought arrived in earnest. The drought that settled over the eastern valley that winter was not the ordinary dry year that the region cycles through. It was the kind of drought that arrives like the opening of a furnace door and does not close. The creek that ran seasonally along the base of the Cerro Prieto Ridge went dry by February, which it had never done in Gustavo Vasquez's memory or in Esperanza Robles's memory, and the small reservoir 3 miles north that several farms depended on for supplemental irrigation dropped to 22% capacity by March and was formally restricted in April. The larger heritage orchards in the valley, the commercial operations that ran on surface water rights and had not invested in wells, began to show the specific suffering of trees that are not getting enough water. Leaves curling at the edges, fruit dropping early, the particular paleness that means a tree is choosing which branches to save. Nora's 2 wells held. They held because Gustavo had sunk them into the confined aquifer beneath the ridge, the same aquifer that Castellan had been accumulating land above for 4 years, and because he had cased them with the thoroughness of a man who cannot afford to do anything twice, and because Nora had maintained them with the same thoroughness. The priority review that the Water District announced was framed as a routine assessment of historic usage rights, but its practical effect, if it went the way Warren Gould's associates on the board intended, would be to reclassify the Cerro Prieto wells as junior appropriations, subordinating them to senior rights held by the larger consolidated parcels below the ridge, parcels that Castellan had been buying for the past 3 years and whose water rights it had been quietly stacking. If the reclassification succeeded, Nora's wells would be last in line. She could stay on her land and watch her trees die, or she could sell. It was Mateo who noticed the survey stake first. Mateo Reyes was 10 years old, the youngest son of Lucinda Reyes, who leased the lower field from Nora for a market garden and who could not afford to pay full market lease rate and paid instead in labor, and in the specific loyalty of someone who has been given ground to stand on when they needed it. Mateo spent his afternoons on the Cerro Prieto property the way children spend time in places that feel safe, with the casual completeness of belonging, and he had given names to the 3 border goats Nora kept for orchard floor clearing. He called them by names that suited them, not the goats exactly, but the idea of them, small and determined, and fond of climbing things that were not designed to be climbed. He found the survey stake on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, at the base of the ridge below the lower well, and he pulled it and brought it to Nora with the directness of a 10-year-old who has not yet learned that some information is better delivered with preamble. He said, "There is a metal stick by the well. It has orange tape. I think someone put it there while you were in town." Nora looked at the stake and then at the date pressed into its cap, which was 3 days prior, and she looked at the property line on the survey map her father had kept folded in the deed box, and the stake was not on her property line. It was 11 feet inside her property line. She photographed it, documented the date stamp, replaced it in the ground exactly where it had been, and called Clara Ibanez. Clara Ibanez said, in the quiet that follows a particularly clear piece of evidence, "Save everything." The encroachment, if it could be shown to be deliberate and connected to the Water District Review, was the kind of fact that changes the shape of a proceeding. It was not by itself enough, but it was a thread, and some things unravel from a single thread if you pull it the right way. The thread led to Warren Gould's own overreach, as threads attached to people who believe they are beyond scrutiny tend to do. At the Water District hearing in May, held in the County Agricultural Extension Building with about 60 people in the room, farmers, ranchers, a reporter from the Valley paper, and Warren Gould sitting in the 3rd row with a man Nora did not recognize, and would later identify as the Holdings water law specialist, Warren Gould was called as a supporter of the reclassification, and he spoke at length about historic usage patterns and the efficiency of consolidated water management and the regrettable situation of small parcels with aging infrastructure creating allocation confusion, and he used, in the course of his presentation, a figure for Nora's average annual well draw that was specific to the gallon, and that was not in any public document or any Water District record, because Nora had never been asked for that figure and had never provided it. It was a number that could only have come from a meter reading taken from a monitor on her well housing, a monitor she had installed but whose readings were not transmitted to any public agency. Clara Ibanez was in the room. She wrote the figure down. She waited for Warren Gould to finish, and then she asked, through the hearing chair, how Castellan Land Holdings had obtained that specific measurement, and Warren Gould smiled the warm, capable smile of a man accustomed to having answers, and said, "It was drawn from district modeling estimates," and Clara Ibanez said that district modeling at that level of precision would require access to the proprietary monitor data, and she would be grateful to see the modeling methodology, and the water law specialist in the 3rd row leaned toward Gould and said something quiet, and Gould said that they would provide documentation in the post-hearing submission period, and that was the moment that the room shifted in the way that rooms shift when the air pressure changes and everyone feels it before they understand it. The figure was too precise. Everyone who farmed in that room knew it was too precise to be modeled, and the survey stake that was 11 feet over the line was suddenly in everyone's mind, even though it had not been mentioned yet, because that is how a single thread works when the room is full of people who have been wondering whether they are also being watched. Nora stood up at that hearing. She had the cardboard box she had brought to the courthouse in August, which is where this story began and to which it has now returned. And she set it on the table at the front of the room, and she did not speak about the survey stake or the meter reading yet, because Clara Ibanez had told her to let the question about the methodology hang in the air until the next moment. What she spoke about was water. She spoke about the 2 wells her father had sunk in 1987, and the aquifer they drew from, and the geological survey her father had commissioned with $1,200 he had saved for 3 years, which was in the cardboard box along with its annotations in his handwriting, and she spoke about what the survey said about the recharge rate of the confined aquifer, which was considerably higher than the district's current modeling suggested, because the district's modeling was based on surface catchment data and did not account for the deep recharge that the ridge geology made possible, and she said that if the district wanted to allocate that aquifer efficiently, the first thing they needed was accurate data, and the accurate data was in her father's survey and in 14 years of her own well logs, which were also in the box. Because Gustavo Vasquez had kept logs, and she had kept logs because the land speaks in a whisper, and you must be very quiet to hear it. And one of the ways you listen is by writing down every number the land gives you, and watching what it tells you over time. She set the survey and the logs on the table. The room was very quiet. Victor Salinas, who farmed 112 acres of stone fruit 3 miles west, and who had been among the first people in the valley to call Nora's original legal challenge a fool's errand, was sitting 4 rows back with his hat in his hands. His stone fruit operation had lost 40% of its crop that spring from water stress. He was 58 years old, and he was looking at the well logs the way a thirsty man looks at a map that shows water. The Water District Board went into a brief recess. During the recess, Warren Gould came to where Nora was standing near the side wall, and he said, with the warmth and the steadiness of a man who has not yet admitted to himself that he has lost, that Castellan was prepared to increase its offer for the Cerro Prieto property to $580,000, subject to a mutual withdrawal of the hearing objection, and that he thought she would find that number very reasonable given the circumstances, and she said no. She said it in one word, plainly, as though she were reporting a fact about the weather, and Warren Gould looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating, and then he said that the drought was not going to end, and that small operations without the capitalization to weather a long dry period were in a very precarious position, and she said she understood, and he said that she might want to think carefully about what she was protecting and whether it was worth protecting, and she said she had thought carefully, and that is the last substantial conversation she had with Warren Gould, because after the recess the board chair announced that the reclassification review was being paused pending an independent hydrological audit of the subbasin, and that the survey documentation submitted by the Vasquez parcel would be incorporated into the audit scope, and that any party wishing to respond to the data questions raised during the session had 30 days to provide methodology documentation. Warren Gould did not submit methodology documentation in 30 days. His associate, the water law specialist, sent a letter requesting an extension, and the extension was granted, and during that extension period Clara Ibanez filed a separate complaint with the district regarding the unlicensed placement of a survey instrument within a titled parcel's boundary, with photographic documentation and a certified date stamp. And the complaint triggered a district investigation, and the investigation found 3 other parcels in the sub-basin where similar stakes had been placed, 2 of which were owned by families who had not noticed them, and all of whom, once notified, withdrew their pending applications to connect to the district's supplemental supply system, which was the mechanism through which Castellan had been planning to assert senior usage rights across the consolidated acreage. The plan was not illegal in its final form. The process of building it had been. That is the difference between knowing what you want and having the right to take it. Victor Salinas came to the Cerro Prieto property on a Thursday evening in June. He drove up the unpaved access road that had always struck him as evidence of a secondary operation, and he sat in the truck for a moment before he got out, and Nora watched from the porch and waited, because some conversations require the other person to decide to have them. He got out and came to the foot of the porch steps and removed his hat, which was the gesture of a man who has been rehearsing a difficult sentence, and he said that his stone fruit was in trouble, and his well was shallow, and the drought was not lifting. And he had a crew of 12 people he was trying to keep employed through the summer, and he said he had been wrong about her and her father's land, and he was sorry for what he had said at the feed store 2 years ago, and he asked whether she would sell water from her wells at whatever price she set. Nora looked at him for a moment, and then she said she would not sell water. He started to speak, and she said, "I will share it." She said that she had spoken with 3 other families in the sub-basin that week, and with Esperanza Robles, who had also maintained deep wells, and who had also been maintaining logs nobody had thought to ask about, and that together the deep wells on the ridge properties could supply supplemental irrigation to the Middle Valley operations through the summer if the usage was coordinated and logged, and everyone agreed to submit the data to the hydrological audit so that the aquifer's recharge rate could be properly documented. Because a resource that is properly documented is a resource that can be protected, and a resource that is protected belongs to everyone who depends on it, not to the entity that can afford to buy it first. She said she would charge for the labor of delivering it, the pump time, the fuel, the hose infrastructure, because labor should be paid, but not for the water itself, which the land had been collecting since before anyone in that valley had been born. Victor Salinas put his hat back on and looked away for a moment at the upper slope, where the apple rows were green in a valley of yellowing things. And when he looked back, his eyes were different, and he said, "All right." The hydrological audit took 4 months. Its findings confirmed what Gustavo Vasquez's 1987 survey had suggested. The confined aquifer beneath Cerro Prieto Ridge had a recharge rate 3 times higher than the district's surface-based model had projected, fed by a deep fractured limestone formation that collected precipitation over a catchment area extending well beyond the visible watershed. The aquifer was not infinite, but it was significantly more resilient than the district had understood, and its resilience was concentrated in the deep wells on the ridge properties, which sat directly above the primary recharge zone. The report recommended against any reclassification of existing well rights in the subbasin. It recommended instead a cooperative usage agreement among the ridge well holders and the Middle Valley operations, with shared monitoring, logged withdrawals, and a technical advisory committee to manage allocation in drought years. It recommended that Gustavo Vasquez's 1987 survey be incorporated into the district's permanent record, with attribution. The report did not mention Castellan land holdings by name. It did not need to. The investigation into the unlicensed survey stakes resulted in a civil settlement that Castellan paid without admitting liability and without public comment, and Warren Gould was reassigned to a different regional division 6 months later, which is how large organizations acknowledge the cost of a failure without saying the word failure. The rains came in October of that year, not abundantly but genuinely, the first true soaking rain since the drought had begun, and the creek along the base of the ridge ran again by November, and the valley smelled like itself again, which is to say like soil and late fruit, and the specific cold of elevation. And Nora walked her terraces in the November light, and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has been right not in the triumphant way, but in the quiet way, which is the only way that costs enough to mean something. Esperanza Robles came over the evening after the first rain. She brought tamales wrapped in cloth, which was the thing she brought when something important had concluded, and they ate at the kitchen table, where the Bible still lived on its shelf. And Esperanza looked at the shelf once and said that Gustavo had known. Nora said she believed that too. Esperanza said he planted something in the dark and told no one because telling would have been beside the point. The point was that it would be there when you needed it. The land speaks in a whisper, she said, and she said it in Spanish the way Gustavo had, and the phrase sounded in the kitchen like something that had always lived there and had simply been waiting for both of them to be in the room together to say it aloud. Mateo Reyes was there too, sitting on the back step with a plate, and the goats nearby in the way they always were, when Mateo was present, crowding the light, and then retreating, and he was listening in the way children listen when they sense that the conversation is not for them, but will matter to them later. Nora thought about her father walking this land in the early mornings with his log notebook and his pencil, and his habit of attention, writing down the water levels and the bricks readings and the soil temperatures in a handwriting that was careful and small and meant to last. She thought about the deed folded into the Gospel of John, which was the gospel that begins not with a birth or a genealogy, but with the assertion that in the beginning there was a Word, and that the Word was with something larger than itself, and that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it, which is a strange thing to put in a legal document, but is perhaps not strange at all if you believe, as Gustavo Vasquez clearly did, that the most reliable shelter a father can build for his daughter is not a house, but an intention, carefully documented, hidden where she will find it when she needs it, and alive in the silence until then. The cooperative agreement was signed by 11 property owners in January of the following year. It established the Cerro Prieto Ridge Water Collective, a non-profit entity with a board of 7, on which Nora served as a founding member alongside Victor Salinas, Esperanza Robles, and Lucinda Reyes. The agreement specified shared monitoring protocols, drought year allocation formulas based on the hydrological audit's recharge data, and a capital fund contributed to by all members for well maintenance and infrastructure, sized at $17 per acre-foot of annual draw. The first item of business at the inaugural board meeting, held in February in the community room of the County Extension Office, was to formalize the incorporation of Gustavo Vasquez's 1987 geological survey into the collective's foundational technical record, with a resolution acknowledging its role in the audit and in the preservation of the subbasin's water rights against reclassification. The resolution passed unanimously. Nora seconded it. She did not make a speech. She signed her name on the resolution and on the articles of incorporation and on the deed record that confirmed the Cerro Prieto property as her sole and separate property, free of encumbrance. And she filed the final copies in the same metal deed box where her father had kept the original survey, the box that sat on the shelf beside the Bible, because she was her father's daughter, and she understood that a thing worth protecting is worth storing carefully, and that the record you keep is the argument you make, and that the argument you make is the ground you stand on, which is, if you have listened carefully enough, the ground that was always yours. The apple trees on the upper slope bloomed in March, later than the valley orchards because the elevation delayed them, but fuller because the roots were deeper and the water table had held. Mateo came up after school on the first warm afternoon to help with the thinning, which is the part of orchard work that feels like loss but is actually investment. The removal of the excess so that what remains can become what it was always capable of being. He worked quietly alongside Nora in the way he had always worked, without needing to be told what to do because he had learned the work by watching, which is the same way the land learns anything that endures. After a while he said that his mother was going to plant a second bed of tomatoes on the lower field this year, because the water share meant she could count on the supplemental supply through August, and Nora said that was good. He said, "She said to tell you thank you." Nora kept thinning. She said, "Tell her she is welcome on this land for as long as she wants to be here." Mateo nodded, as though this was the expected answer, because it was. The afternoon light moved across the terrace the way it does in spring on a ridge property, in long horizontal bands that make even an ordinary moment look like something a person painted with the intention of being remembered. And the land was quiet in the way that land is quiet after a long difficulty, not empty but resting, holding what it holds, releasing what it is ready to release, speaking in the whisper that you can only hear if you have been patient enough and still enough and honest enough about what you owe it and what it owes you, which is nothing and everything, which is the same thing Gustavo Vasquez had written at the bottom of the last page of his 1987 survey notebook in his careful small handwriting in Spanish, in a sentence that translated roughly to, "The land does not belong to us. We belong to it. If we are good stewards, it will keep us."
Et j'ai pas réussi. J'ai pas réussi à l'avoir, les copains. J'ai pas ouvert le truc, mais je pense que l'événement est terminé pour ma part. Donc du coup, j'ai été obligée d'avancer dans l'histoire pour récupérer des fragments au plus possible, mais ça a pas marché. Ça a pas marché. On a tout donné. On a tout donné. On y a tous cru, mais non, 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 il m'a donné plein, oui, ouais, papy t'a vachement aidé. On a eu, hein, on a eu des héros, mais c'était pas Méliodas. Ah là là, voilà, donc on va aller voir ce qu'ils disent. J'ai vite fait regarder parce que si je nous ai envoyé un message, hem, j'ai rien capté à ce qu'il a envoyé, mais c'est pas grave. Attendez, c'est où? Parle de la maintenance, tout ça, tout ça. Badadam, badam. Ouais, donc ils disent en gros que demain c'est de 5 heures à 9 heures, mais comme on n'est pas sur le même fuseau horaire, je ne suis pas sûre que ce soit réellement 5 heures 9 heures demain. Voilà, pour les news. Bon, Flavie, est-ce que tu en vacances? T'es en repos? T'es en quoi? T'as travaillé? Soutien émotionnel. Ça fait beaucoup, hein, mine de rien, un soutien émotionnel. Ça fait beaucoup, hein. Ah oui, elle est là. Il est prêt, hein. Il est toujours là. Alors que je le décale après, mais hop là. Tu reprends le taf ce soir? OK.